The story begins with a quiet morning at a busy international airport. People rushed from one gate to another, some holding coffee, some carrying bags, and some simply lost in their own thoughts. Among all these faces, she blended in so well that no one looked at her a second time. She wore a simple jacket, carried a small backpack, and walked calmly as if she had nowhere special to be. That was the strange part. She moved with a kind of stillness that didn't match the energy around her. To anyone watching, she seemed like a regular woman taking a normal commercial flight. No one knew that a single detail about her past could shake trained military pilots thousands of feet above the ground. But on the surface, she looked ordinary. She chose a window seat, placed her bag carefully under the seat, and sat quietly as the rest of the passengers filled the cabin. She didn't speak much, only offering a soft smile whenever someone passed by. The cabin crew noticed the same thing everyone else did. She was polite, calm, and almost invisible. Many passengers complained about delays or seat changes, but she simply listened and nodded. It was as if nothing troubled her, not even the long journey ahead. She looked outside the window for a long time, watching the runway workers move around like small figures. Something in her gaze felt old, as if she had seen the sky in a different way before, far more closely than any commercial passenger ever would. When the plane finally began taxiing, she closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because she knew the sound, the vibration, the climb all too well. She knew the exact moment the engines would roar louder, the exact pressure shift in the cabin, and the exact second the wheels would lift off. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, but her breathing slowed as if she was preparing herself for something she didn't want to remember. Once the plane reached altitude, the captain made the usual announcement about weather conditions and arrival time. Passengers settled into movies, snacks, and conversations. But she simply looked ahead, almost waiting for something unseen. People assumed she was anxious or shy, but the truth was different. She wasn't afraid of flying. She simply knew too much about it. A few rows behind her, an older couple talked quietly about the news, how fighter jets were patrolling the northern zone that week. She heard the words and paused. She wasn't trying to listen, but those words always reached her, no matter where she was. Fighter jets, patrol routes, call signs. It was as if her brain could never fully switch off that old part of her life. Outside the aircraft, everything seemed calm. The sky stretched wide and empty, the clouds forming soft layers below. But far away, 2 F-22 fighter jets were already in the air on routine patrol. Nothing unusual had appeared on their radar. Nothing alarming had been reported. They were relaxed, even talking casually through their secure channel. Inside the commercial plane, a small unexpected moment happened. A child sitting across the aisle accidentally pressed the flight attendant call button. The soft ding echoed, followed by a brief beep that connected to the cockpit communication panel. It was nothing unusual, just a routine sound. But for her, that tiny beep triggered a memory. Not a painful one, but a sharp one, something instinctive, almost automatic. Her posture straightened slightly. The real twist, however, began not inside the plane, but outside it. The F-22 pilots received a short digital signal on their systems. It wasn't from the aircraft's transponder. It wasn't from ground control. It was a tiny, almost impossible to detect frequency, a signal that should not exist anymore. Signal that carried an old military call sign. The system displayed a code that both pilots knew by heart. A code they had been trained to respect. A code they thought had been retired years ago. At that same moment, inside the commercial plane, something subtle changed in her expression. Her eyes opened, calm but alert, almost as if she sensed something shifting around her. She didn't know yet. But the F-22 pilots were already staring at their screens in disbelief, because they had just detected her call sign, and the sky that was calm only seconds ago was no longer the same. Asterisk. The story begins with a quiet morning at a busy international airport. People rushed from one gate to another, some holding coffee, some carrying bags, and some simply lost in their own thoughts. Among all these faces, she blended in so well that no one looked at her a second time. She wore a simple jacket, carried a small backpack, and walked calmly as if she had nowhere special to be. That was the strange part. She moved with a kind of stillness that didn't match the energy around her. To anyone watching, she seemed like a regular woman taking a normal commercial flight. No one knew that a single detail about her past could shake trained military pilots thousands of feet above the ground. But on the surface, she looked ordinary. She chose a window seat, placed her bag carefully under the seat, and sat quietly as the rest of the passengers filled the cabin. She didn't speak much, only offering a soft smile whenever someone passed by. The cabin crew noticed the same thing everyone else did. She was polite, calm, and almost invisible. Many passengers complained about delays or seat changes, but she simply listened and nodded. It was as if nothing troubled her, not even the long journey ahead. She looked outside the window for a long time, watching the runway workers move around like small figures. Something in her gaze felt old, as if she had seen the sky in a different way before, far more closely than any commercial passenger ever would. When the plane finally began taxiing, she closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because she knew the sound, the vibration, the climb, all too well. She knew the exact moment the engines would roar louder, the exact pressure shift in the cabin, and the exact second the wheels would lift off. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, but her breathing slowed as if she was preparing herself for something she didn't want to remember. Once the plane reached altitude, the captain made the usual announcement about weather conditions and arrival time. Passengers settled into movies, snacks, and conversations. But she simply looked ahead, almost waiting for something unseen. People assumed she was anxious or shy, but the truth was different. She wasn't afraid of flying. She simply knew too much about it. A few rows behind her, an older couple talked quietly about the news, how fighter jets were patrolling the northern zone that week. She heard the words and paused. She wasn't trying to listen, but those words always reached her, no matter where she was. Fighter jets, patrol routes, call signs. It was as if her brain could never fully switch off that old part of her life. Outside the aircraft, everything seemed calm. The sky stretched wide and empty, the clouds forming soft layers below. But far away, 2 F-22 fighter jets were already in the air on routine patrol. Nothing unusual had appeared on their radar. Nothing alarming had been reported. They were relaxed, even talking casually through their secure channel. Inside the commercial plane, a small unexpected moment happened. A child sitting across the aisle accidentally pressed the flight attendant call button. The soft ding echoed, followed by a brief beep that connected to the cockpit communication panel. It was nothing unusual, just a routine sound. But for her, that tiny beep triggered a memory. Not a painful one, but a sharp one, something instinctive, almost automatic. Her posture straightened slightly. The real twist, however, began not inside the plane, but outside it. The F-22 pilots received a short digital signal on their systems. It wasn't from the aircraft's transponder. It wasn't from ground control. It was a tiny, almost impossible to detect frequency, a signal that should not exist anymore. Signal that carried an old military call sign. The system displayed a code that both pilots knew by heart. A code they had been trained to respect. A code they thought had been retired years ago. At that same moment, inside the commercial plane, something subtle changed in her expression. Her eyes opened, calm but alert, almost as if she sensed something shifting around her. She didn't know yet. But the F-22 pilots were already staring at their screens in disbelief. Because they had just detected her call sign, and the sky that was calm only seconds ago was no longer the same. The commercial flight continued smoothly, the engines humming softly against the thin air. Most passengers were relaxed now. Some slept with their heads leaning awkwardly on the side, while others scrolled through their phones or talked quietly. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening inside the cabin. Yet something invisible had already begun beneath the surface, something only a few trained people in the world could sense. She could not hear the F-22 jets outside, but she felt a strange pressure in the air. It was a familiar shift, the kind that only someone who had spent years around high-altitude operations would recognize. Her eyes moved subtly toward the window, almost out of instinct. The sky looked normal, a soft blue stretching endlessly, but her heartbeat changed by a fraction so small that no one else could notice. Far away, the two F-22 pilots stared at their cockpit screens without speaking. The call sign that appeared was not a regular one. It was old, so old that new pilots read about it only in secure briefings. It belonged to someone who had once been part of missions that were never discussed openly. A person believed to have disappeared from official records. A person they were told to never interfere with, unless absolutely necessary. The older pilot finally broke the silence. "This can't be real," he muttered, his voice low. The younger pilot didn't reply. He had heard stories from senior officers about a legendary call sign that carried a weight no one questioned. A call sign connected to someone who vanished from service without explanation. Yet the digital signal was not a mistake. It was faint, but clear. Inside the commercial plane, she tried to keep her breathing steady. She was not nervous, but she could feel something approaching, something she had hoped would never come near her again. She placed her hand near the small tray table, grounding herself. A passenger next to her asked if she was fine. She offered a small smile and nodded. She didn't want attention. She never did. The aircraft officer in the cockpit received a strange notice through his system. A request appeared from the control center. Maintain current altitude. Do not alter route. This message was unusual, but not alarming. He followed the instruction without questioning it. The passengers continued their normal routines, unaware that two military jets were quietly adjusting their speed and formation. The F-22s were closing the distance between themselves and the commercial flight, not aggressively, not rapidly, but with careful precision. Their mission now wasn't to confront. It was to confirm. But confirm what? The older pilot finally contacted ground command on a secure channel. "We're receiving a call sign that shouldn't be in the air. Can you verify?" A long pause followed. It was the kind of pause that never happened in regular communication. Long, tense, filled with someone on the other end trying to decide what to say. Finally, the reply came. "Do not engage. Keep distance. Observe only." The pilots exchanged a glance. "Observe only." That instruction was rare, reserved for situations involving individuals whose identities were kept in the shadows. Meanwhile, she closed her eyes again, but not to rest this time. She was listening, not with ears, but with memory. She remembered a certain frequency pattern, a coded rhythm in the air that only a few people had ever been trained to recognize. It was faint but present, like an old voice calling from far away. She whispered something quietly, not a word, but more like a breath, a reflex. A habit built during long missions she no longer wanted to remember. A child near her dropped a toy, and she reached down to pick it up with a gentle smile. Her face looked calm again, returning to the quiet passenger everyone assumed she was. But deep inside, she knew the jets outside had noticed something. And once something like that happened, the sky rarely stayed silent. The F-22s moved into a parallel path, not too close, not too far. The younger pilot watched the commercial plane thoughtfully. "Do you think it's really her?" he asked. The senior pilot didn't answer immediately. He exhaled slowly, then said, "If it is, then we're flying next to someone we were trained never to question. Inside the cabin, the woman looked out again. For a brief second, a faint light flashed far in the distance, just a speck. Not visible to anyone else, but she saw it clearly. Her jaw tightened ever so slightly. She whispered in her mind the same thing she once used to say before every mission. Not again. But fate had already turned its wheels, because the sky recognized her before any human did. The commercial flight moved forward through calm blue air, but the atmosphere around it no longer felt simple. Something unseen surrounded the aircraft, now an unspoken tension that only a few people could sense. She could feel it the way a person feels a change in weather before the clouds even form. It was a quiet awareness that settled gently on her shoulders. A flight attendant walked by and asked passengers if they needed water. When she reached the quiet woman, she paused. "You're very calm today," she said kindly. "Long trip ahead?" The woman gave a small smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. "Just routine," she replied in a soft voice. But nothing about this flight was routine anymore. Outside, the F-22 jets adjusted formation again, but this time more carefully. They were not closing in, only moving parallel in a way that matched the commercial plane's speed with almost mathematical precision. To any normal person, they would remain invisible, too far, too fast. But she noticed tiny reflections on the edge of the clouds. She recognized those reflections instantly. They were impossible to forget. Her pulse didn't rise, yet her shoulders straightened again. Years of training never left completely. Even when a person walks away from a life, some instincts follow quietly like a shadow. Inside the fighter jets, both pilots were now fully alert. They had run every system check twice. The digital signal they picked up still lingered faintly on their screens, as if waiting for someone to acknowledge it. The younger pilot tried to decode it again, even though the system had already done it perfectly. "It's the same call sign," he whispered. "No error, no misread." The older pilot kept his hand steady on the controls. "If that call sign is active," he said quietly, "then someone very important is sitting in that aircraft. And she doesn't want anyone to know." The younger pilot swallowed. "But why would she send the signal?" "That's the strange part," the senior pilot replied. "People with that call sign don't send signals. They avoid them." A silence drifted between them again. The jet engines hummed, slicing through the sky like sharp lines of silver. Back inside the commercial plane, the woman reached for her backpack, not to open it, but simply to rest her fingers on the strap. It was a grounding gesture, a reminder of who she had become after leaving her old life. She had hoped she could fly in peace, unnoticed, unrecognized. But the world above the clouds rarely forgot people like her. A small turbulence bump shook the aircraft. Passengers gasped softly, but it was minor. The woman hardly reacted at all. She kept her eyes steady on the sky outside, watching for shadows, reflections, anything unusual. She wasn't afraid. She was assessing. The captain made an announcement about the slight turbulence, his voice calm. But he didn't mention the detail he had just received quietly in the cockpit, a second instruction from ground control. "Do not deviate altitude. Maintain exact path. Await further notice." This message was more unusual than the first. The co-pilot, curious but professional, asked, "Is something happening outside?" The captain shook his head slowly. "Nothing dangerous, but something is being monitored." That word carried weight, even in a peaceful sky. Meanwhile, one of the F-22 pilots clicked a private channel only the two jets shared. "If she's really on board, what do we do?" The younger pilot asked. "We wait," the senior pilot said. "We only act if she acts." "Act how?" The older pilot sighed. "Someone with that call sign doesn't act unless the sky itself forces them." A strange feeling passed through the younger pilot, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and nervous anticipation. Whoever that passenger was, she wasn't ordinary. Even from thousands of feet away, her presence bent the entire protocol of 2 fighter jets. Inside the cabin, she suddenly turned her gaze slightly upward, as if listening to something only she could hear. A subtle tension moved across her face, not fear, but recognition. Something in the air changed. A frequency shift, a signal echo, a whisper from the world she once walked away from. She knew the jets were there now. Not by sight, but by that invisible pressure she felt in her chest. A pressure she had learned to read long ago. She whispered silently, "So they found me." Not angry, not frightened, only resigned. She looked at the sky one more time, and a faint reflection flickered near the clouds. Proof. The F-22 pilots saw something change on their radar too. Not a threat, not a danger, but a confirmation. She was aware of them. And when someone with her call sign became aware, the entire sky began to hold its breath. The sky around the commercial plane looked calm, but calm skies often hid the most complex stories. Everyone inside the cabin acted as if they were on an ordinary flight. Some people laughed quietly, some read magazines, and others leaned back to rest. No one had the slightest idea that the aircraft was now moving through a controlled path, watched carefully by 2 F-22 jets flying high above the clouds. She sat still, yet her senses were sharper than before. She could almost feel the presence of the jets outside like a distant heartbeat. She knew they weren't there for danger. They were there because of her. But she hadn't done anything, no signal, no request, nothing. And that confusion sat quietly inside her mind. A memory tugged at her without warning. A long hallway. Bright lights. The sound of boots on polished floors. A voice telling her she was different, not because of strength, but because she could remain calm when others couldn't. She pushed the memory away gently. This wasn't the moment to revisit the past. She had spent years trying to leave that life behind, and she wasn't going to collapse into old thoughts now. A soft announcement interrupted her thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, we will experience slight route adjustments due to air traffic. Nothing to worry about. Passengers nodded without concern. It sounded normal, but she knew better. Air traffic didn't cause such precise instructions. Air traffic didn't require fighter jets to shadow a commercial plane. A child nearby asked his mother, "Why did the plane turn?" His mother smiled. "Just normal flying, honey." The woman heard this and felt a brief warmth. Ordinary explanations were beautiful. She wished her life could have stayed ordinary too. Outside, the F-22s flew in silent formation. The younger pilot looked at the commercial aircraft from his side window. He couldn't see the passengers clearly, but he wondered who she might be. What kind of person lived a life that made 2 trained pilots follow protocol written only for extreme situations? "She knows we're here," he said quietly. The senior pilot nodded. "She always knows." "You've flown near her before?" the younger one asked. "No," the older pilot replied. "But people who trained me did. They said she never needed a radar to sense danger. She felt it like a change in temperature." The younger pilot looked at his screen again. The faint call sign signal still lingered in the background. It wasn't strong enough to identify her directly, but strong enough to confirm her presence. A half-forgotten legend sitting quietly on a commercial passenger seat. Inside the plane, she felt a tiny vibration underneath her feet, a shift so small no one else noticed. Not turbulence, not wind. It was the weight of a decision forming. Not from her, but from the world watching her from above. A flight attendant stopped beside her row again. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. "You seem very focused today." The woman nodded softly. "I'm fine, just thinking. If you need anything, let me know," the attendant said with a kind smile before walking away. Thinking. Yes, that was one word for it. She wasn't afraid, but she was preparing. For what? She did not know. She only understood that when her call sign resurfaced. Life never continued the same way afterward. The plane began a gentle left turn too smooth to alarm anyone. But the change aligned the aircraft perfectly with a new flight corridor. A corridor reserved only for controlled situations that stayed off public knowledge. The younger pilot exhaled. They're moving her into the protected path. The senior pilot didn't look surprised. Of course. Someone doesn't want her disturbed. A strange mix of respect and unease filled the cockpit. It was one thing to protect a VIP. It was another to escort someone whose history could not be discussed, not even with other pilots. Back inside the cabin, she opened her eyes again. The slight turn of the plane told her what she needed to know. "They're guiding us," she whispered under her breath. Not controlling. Guiding. It meant the jets had confirmed something. Something only they and a handful of officials understood. She rested her palm gently near the window. Just for a moment. Just enough to ground herself in the present. Whatever was ahead, she would face it quietly. But deep in her heart, she wondered something she never wanted to ask again. Why now? Because the world had forgotten her. But the sky clearly hadn't. The commercial plane continued along its new path, steady and calm, but the sky around it felt unusually organized, almost as if invisible hands were rearranging everything to create a protected corridor. To the passengers, nothing seemed different. Drinks were served, lights were dimmed, soft music played through tiny headphones. But she knew the truth. Every movement of this aircraft was now under quiet supervision. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a moment. She wasn't trying to rest. She was trying to listen. There were patterns in the air, subtle, soft, almost like echoes. Only a few people in the world could sense them, and she wished she wasn't one of those people. When she opened her eyes again, a soft golden light filled the cabin. Sunset had begun far below them. The clouds looked like glowing islands drifting in an endless sea. For a moment, she almost forgot everything. The jets, the call sign, the past. The sky looked peaceful again, but peace, she knew, never stayed with her for long. The captain stepped out of the cockpit for a quick stretch. He smiled politely at passengers as he walked by, but when he glanced toward her row, his smile faded slightly, not out of suspicion, but out of something he couldn't explain. Something about her presence felt significant. Not threatening, just significant. He didn't say anything to her, but after a few seconds, he quietly returned to the cockpit with a strange weight in his expression. The co-pilot noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" "Yes," the captain said softly. "I just felt something. Hard to explain." "About the passenger?" The captain didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. Inside the fighter jets, the younger pilot checked the signal again. It had almost faded now, but not fully. It was like a whisper refusing to disappear entirely. Why would she take a commercial flight? He asked. The senior pilot replied calmly, maybe because she wanted a normal life. What kind of life brings fighter jets to follow you even when you're trying to be normal? The older pilot's silence said enough. Back in the cabin, a gentle tremor ran through the plane. Not turbulence, just a small shift in air pressure. She straightened her posture. Something was changing again. The plane wasn't in danger, but it was entering a region where communication frequencies behaved differently. She knew this region, not from traveling, from training. The air here carried signals differently, bouncing them in unpredictable ways. If her call sign appeared here, even faintly, someone somewhere was deliberately trying to reach her. A child in the seat ahead giggled and turned around to wave at her. She smiled softly and waved back. It reminded her of simpler days, long before she had a call sign anyone recognized. Back when she could walk through airports without feeling watched by invisible systems. She looked at the sky through the window. A small flash reflected off something distant. Not the jets, they were too far. This reflection was higher, almost above their altitude. Her breath paused for a second. That wasn't a jet. That wasn't anything a passenger jet should be flying. Near. It was something she recognized instantly, an old satellite relay pattern. The kind used for encrypted signals many years ago. A system that should have been deactivated. The younger F-22 pilot noticed it too. "Sir, do you see that reflection?" "I see it," the older pilot replied, his tone serious now. "And that confirms it." "Confirms what?" "That someone is trying to make contact with her." The younger pilot froze. "Contact?" After all these years? The older pilot nodded slowly. They wouldn't try unless something important was happening. Inside the plane, she felt the same heaviness the pilots felt. Something from her past was reaching out, not to chase her, but to signal her. A quiet message, a reminder, a request. She didn't know which one it was yet. She held the armrest gently, grounding herself. She had lived many years without hearing anything from that world. She had learned to enjoy silence, to enjoy being normal, to enjoy being unseen. But now the sky was speaking again. A soft whisper from a life she had walked away from. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it, but the message, whatever it was, had already reached her. And the sky never spoke without reason. The commercial plane glided forward through quiet skies. But inside her mind, nothing felt quiet anymore. The strange reflection she saw, the faint pressure in the air, the old satellite relay pattern. It all pointed to something she had hoped would never return. She had lived years believing that chapter of her life was closed forever. Yet, here she was, thousands of feet above the ground, feeling the weight of a signal that belonged to a world she had abandoned. She took a slow breath, steady and controlled. The passengers around her had no idea how carefully she was listening, not with her ears, but with a sense she had spent years trying to hide. Even after walking away, some things never truly faded. A soft chime rang inside the cabin as the seatbelt sign switched on. The captain's voice followed with calm reassurance. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering a zone of unusual winds. Please stay seated. Unusual winds." A polite explanation. But she knew the truth. The aircraft was now entering an area where old military frequencies could still bounce in unpredictable ways. The perfect place for a hidden message. She looked outside again. The sky looked peaceful, but something about the air felt heavier. Not dangerous, just purposeful. Behind her row, two passengers discussed a movie. Another flipped through a magazine. A man near the aisle rubbed his eyes tiredly. Everything looked normal. Completely normal. But the sky outside did not match. That calmed. The F-22 pilots also sensed it. The younger pilot leaned forward, staring at his radar screen. Another reflection. Same pattern as before. The older pilot's voice lowered. "That means someone is definitely trying to reach her. But why now?" the younger pilot asked. "Why today? Why this flight?" The senior pilot didn't answer immediately. He had flown for decades, but this situation carried a weight even he hadn't expected. Finally he said, "Some people don't get called unless the situation is beyond serious." The younger pilot swallowed. "So, she wasn't just any pilot, was she?" "No," the older one replied quietly. "She was one of the few who didn't just follow orders. She understood the sky in a way machines couldn't." He looked toward the commercial aircraft as if trying to see through it. People like her don't return unless the sky itself asks them to. Inside the cabin, her fingers moved slightly against the armrest as a faint frequency pulse brushed through the air. Barely there, almost ghost-like, but she felt it. A message, not spoken, not written, just present. Something old. Something familiar. And then, it happened. A soft vibration moved through the aircraft, so tiny that most passengers didn't even notice. But she did. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't mechanical. It was a handshake signal. A Coded pattern only a small number of pilots in the world had ever been taught to understand. Each short pulse meant something. Each gap carried meaning. It was not a request for help. Not a warning. Not a command. It was a confirmation. A confirmation that someone knew exactly where she was. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the pattern settle in her memory. Her heart didn't race, but it tightened slightly. She had thought she was done with this language. She had thought the sky no longer needed her. A flight attendant walked by with a warm smile. "Everything okay? Need water?" She shook her head gently. "I'm fine. Thank you." Fine, a simple word that covered 1,000 truths. The aircraft continued forward, but the captain received another coded message in the cockpit, unreadable to him, but forwarded automatically through the system. He frowned at the unusual symbol on the screen. "Have you ever seen this code?" he asked the co-pilot. The co-pilot shook his head. "No idea what it means." The captain hesitated, then said, "Whatever it is, someone else is watching this flight very closely." Back outside, the F-22s kept their formation flawlessly. The younger pilot's voice was tight with anticipation. "Sir, what if she ignores the signal?" "She won't," the senior pilot said quietly. "People like her don't ignore the sky." Inside the cabin, she finally exhaled slowly. The decision she had been avoiding was now standing quietly. In front of her, someone was calling her back, not loudly, not urgently, but clearly. She turned her face back to the window, her eyes reflecting the fading sunset. The warm light softened her features, but the truth inside her was becoming sharper. Her past had found her, and the real question was not why, it was what comes next. The sky outside slowly shifted from warm orange to deep blue as the aircraft continued its guided path. Night was forming quietly around the plane, wrapping it in a soft, dark calm. Passengers settled deeper into their seats, unaware that something far more delicate than danger was unfolding, a reunion between a woman and a sky that had never forgotten her. She rested her fingertips lightly on the window. The glass felt cool, almost grounding. Yet the world beyond it felt warmer, more alive, as if the sky itself was waiting for her answer. That faint handshake signal still echoed inside her mind. Not fading, not demanding, just waiting. She closed her eyes for a short moment. She remembered the days when she lived in constant motion briefings, coded messages, silent flights that carried more responsibility than most people would ever imagine. Back then, her call sign wasn't just a name. It was a promise she eventually walked away from. The aircraft lights dimmed as if respecting her thoughts. Someone coughed softly. A baby yawned. A flight attendant whispered instructions to a passenger who couldn't sleep. All these tiny sounds formed a gentle world, the normal world she had chosen, but the sky was asking her something now. And she couldn't ignore it anymore. The captain made a quiet announcement. "We've received updated flight instructions. Everything is normal. Please relax and enjoy the remainder of the flight." His calm voice carried a hidden layer of confusion. Updated instructions didn't usually come this late into a route. But he followed them without hesitation. Far outside, the F-22 jets stayed perfectly aligned with the commercial plane. Their presence was calm, respectful, almost protective. Inside the cockpit of one jet, the younger pilot spoke softly. "Sir, do you think she'll respond?" The senior pilot watched the horizon, the glow of night reflecting in his visor. "If she chooses silence, that is her right," he said. "But people like her. They rarely stay silent when the sky calls." The younger pilot nodded slowly. "So this is her choice now?" "Yes," the older pilot replied. "It always has been." Inside the commercial aircraft, she gently unzipped the small pocket of her backpack. Not fast, not dramatic, just a slow, thoughtful motion. Inside was nothing unusual, just a folded paper, worn at the edges, something she hadn't opened in years. She unfolded it quietly. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't instructions. It wasn't an identification. It was a handwritten promise she once made to herself. One day you will choose peace. And when that day comes, you will not look back. Her eyes softened. Peace. That was the life she had chosen.